Thank you for joining us. I'm Dan Jones, Creative Director for the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, What's in a Name Part 3, Podvin Park and White Bear High School Neighborhoods. This is the third program in our series exploring the history of the name of streets, parks, schools, buildings, and a little bit more in the 5 municipalities that the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society serves. Appreciation goes out to our partners, the Ramsey County Library. Today's program has been funded in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, better known as legacy funds, which are distributed by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency, a Minnesota regional public library system that promotes cooperation amongst its 8 member systems in the Twin Cities metro area, and the members of the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society. Joining me today is Sarah Hansen. Sarah's job is to keep me in control. Sarah is the executive director of the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society. Say hello here, Sarah. I don't know if she wants to unmute herself or not.
Hello. Hello. I will do my best to keep you in control, but
that's all you probably can do this evening.
I will monitor the Q&A and take care of that piece. You're off and running.
All right. Before we get started, a brief explanation is helpful as to what names we've researched. Names that are obvious, alphabetic, numeric, or generic have not been really researched at all. Example of this are the Matamidi streets that are named after trees and flowers and go north alphabetically. But some generic names aren't what they appear to be, so more on that later. Also, we're not going to include streets numerically named. Pretty obvious how 3rd Street got its name, and park names such as like Fox Meadow and White Bear Township. They're pretty basic names, pretty names, but basic. 2 notes regarding the maps and aerial images that we're going to be using this evening. 1, the direction north will always be at the top of the screen. And 2, the images and maps have been sourced from the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society, Ramsey County, the state of Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, the Minnesota Historical Society, the Minnesota Digital Library, and the Library of Congress. And we are very appreciative for all those institutions for providing and sharing that. Let's get started with our area map for reference for today. The neighborhoods we'll be exploring today are Podvin Park to the White Bear Lake Area High School Meeting North Campus. The west border is going to be Otter Lake Road, south is going to be 4th Street, east is Division Avenue, and the north border is the Canadian Pacific Railroad tracks that serve as one of the borders between the city of White Bear Lake and White Bear Township. So zooming in on this area, we're going to be using Podvin Park. Everybody kind of knows where Podvin Park is as a reference point marked with a yellow star to help everyone orient themselves as to where we are on all the maps and the aerial images. And starting out on our first map, we believe the earliest map that includes the White Bear area, at least the official earliest map, which references Bears Lake, most likely White Bear and Bald Eagle Lakes, given the proximity of how close they are. This original map was made by Joseph Nicolet, a French astronomer and a cartographer. Numerous places have been named in honor of Mr. Nicolet, including a county park, city, an island, and at least one avenue, and I'm sure there's a lot more out there. So that was 1843, and you can see on the map, here's Lake of the Isles coming right through here. Bears Lake, obviously, up over here. Fort Snelling is here. So this was really the first time that the White Bear area had been officially put down on a map. Moving on, a more detailed and geographically accurate map is the 1847-1848 White Bear Township Plat Survey map, completed the year before Minnesota became a territory in 1849. Interesting footnotes to the map is that there's an addendum that was super specific addressing the location, the exact location of Bald Eagle Island. And was it correct? And also, if you look down here, you'll see that the lakes, there's a lake right down here. We don't know what it is. The lakes are outlined in the darker with the blue. So example, this is White Bear Lake. Here's Bald Eagle Lake up at the top. This is Birch Lake right here. This should be Goose Lake, but just notice that it's not listed as a lake, but some other body of water to the south, which we've yet to identify, has really, we don't know what it is. Next map is an 1859 Ramsey County Township sectional plat map. The additions from 1848 is there are now 2 roads entering from St. Paul into White Bear. They are the White Bear Lake Road and an unnamed road. It's possible, you can see them coming up right here. It's possible that it was Little Canada Road. That's coming out of St. Paul, but for a while it doesn't have a label on it before it is labeled Little Canada Road. The roads merge between Gem and Lambert Lakes and then split, becoming Rice Lake Road going up to the north, and then White Bear Lake Road going out to the northeast, which, veers into the downtown area. The two roads run parallel to each other past that, which is what basically is Interstate 35E today. 1874, the major difference that we see on this is that the railroad is now here. Railroad came through in 1868. It was the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad. Downtown White Bear area and South Bald Eagle have been laid out. Also, it's interesting to see the Podvin Park. The Freeman family own most of the land surrounding Podvin Park. Moving on to the 1882 map, things are getting a little detailed. Things are happening. Now, just because you see blocks being added, or it's really plats, these are a little bit of the dreaming is happening. So this is the 1882 Ramsey County Township sectional map, which again shows a lot of changes over the past 8 years since the previous map. With the downtown growth, the area officially incorporated as the village of White Bear in 1881 with a population of 435 people. Cottage Park, Ramaley Park, and Manitou Island are pretty much platted and the homes are there. And now the Freemans, by the way, have sold the Podvin Park area to Edward Long of Long Avenue that parallels Highway 61 north of the Hannaful Performing Arts Center and the White Bear Center for the Arts. Moving on to 1898, growth continued, but it was at a little bit slower pace. But officially, at least 5 new additions have now been added to the village. Moving on to 1916. Not a lot of changes on the plat map of 1916, mostly property ownership changes. You can see that the Podvin Park property, formerly owned by Edward Long, has been subdivided into 2 parcels and now is owned by R.H. Long and F.E. Long, right around here. Well, guess who? These are the sons of Edward and Ernestine Long, Franklin on the south, Rudolph on the north. So moving on to 1922, things are really happening, obviously. Hard to believe this was 100 years ago, but this is the county plat map, which was completed just 1 year after the village of White Bear was reorganized into the city of White Bear Lake, with a population of about just 2,000 people. Most likely the plat maps were made in 1920-21, so the designation of village/city is not noted, meaning city is not noted. Most of the area to the west of Highway 61 to Birch Lake has now been subdivided. So everything off over on this section. The new White Bear High School, built in 1918 in Ramsey County Fairgrounds, are now listed. The city and or village limits are depicted by the yellow lines and listed as Dillon Street as the western border and 9th Street as the northern border. So in other words, the yellow lines, that's the city of White Bear Lake. Everything outside of that is the township. It is worth mentioning a little historical footnote here that the 1922 plat maps would be used by Ramsey County until 1980. They were just updated with handwritten notes that you can see across, especially up here in Township, Campanaro Gardens area, off to the west. Found that very interesting. It's not terribly surprising, just because of the Depression, World War II. Kind of weird with the housing boom in the 50s. You'd think they would have created new maps at that time, but they didn't. All right, moving on to 1952, jumping 3 decades, is the U.S. Geological Survey map. Interesting about this map is that it not only shows roads, but the shape and or footprints of the buildings. You can see Lincoln Elementary as a building right here, and Washington School down over here. And then again, of course, you've got the fairgrounds and the high school that were built at that time. Moving on to the 1967, this is our last map. So for those of you who don't particularly enjoy maps, we're going to move on to aerial photography quickly. But according to the map legend, red tint areas in which only landmark buildings are shown. So obviously things have developed, growth out. It's 1967. Population of the city is roughly 12 to 14,000 at this point. So there has been immense growth. And you can see up in the northeast corner of the screen, the Round School is there, and the fairgrounds, which was formerly there, have been replaced by that officially. You can also see that the streets of south of 9th Street have been completed. Here's your 9th Street. As you can see, Podvin Park there. There's our 9th Street, which served as a long-term border of the city slash village slash township of as far as residential growth. And you can see in 1967, nothing was happening except really around the perf bald eagle and just 9th on that. So switching to aerial views, 1940, these are fun because now you can start to see what was really there. 1940, we can see that you can distinctly see that the development is still close, hugging over to Bald Eagle Boulevard, and all the land in the Podvin Park area is farm. Moving from the right to the left, you can clearly see that the Ramsey County Fairgrounds horse track, these pin drops that I've placed here, racetrack is up there. The arch sidewalks, it was kind of fun for me because looking at these aerial photos, you can always pick out the high school right away because of these arch sidewalks. All right, moving on to 1953. Again, there's our star of Podvin Park. The 19 aerial shows that the start of the baby boom has begun. 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th have been laid out between Dillon Street and Woodcrest and Wood Avenue, including there's about 3 dozen homes. In 1952, Lincoln Elementary was built, which you can see right here. You can see the shadow of that. One interesting footnote on this pin drop, if you can see, this is actually Price Field. And they put lights in 1948. The Price Field, by the way, was named after Charles M. Price, who served as president of the White Bear Lake School Board from 1918 until he retired in 1953, the same year this picture was taken. That is a long time to serve on the school board, but I think that's funny to see the shadows of the lights coming down on there. Also as visible is the northern extension of the high school that we'll talk about later. And this was all happening, by the way, the same year, 1953 was the year that the school district purchased the former Ramsey County Fairgrounds for quote unquote future development. Moving on to 1957, now you can see dirt really being pushed. And the pin mark on the left is the first of the Interlake Park subdivisions are being developed on the west side. Over 80 homes have come in, built on Carolyn, Sharon, and Peggy lanes. Also in the middle pin, you can see 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th streets are being laid out. They're not fully connected, but they're almost there. 1960, this one I'm going to bounce back and forth. These are very interesting to see as far as the development that happens. It's just literally in 3 years, you go from just the previous streets on the west to now it's just boom coming in and it's being completed. This was the 1950s, folks, all over town, all over the United States and suburbia. So 1960, seeing the growth and the development from there. 1966, things are still happening. You can see that Lincoln Elementary now has a new addition. So you can see the photography keeps on getting a little bit sharper and better, by the way. So Lincoln has this new addition that was added in 1961 and the new 100,000 square foot building. Reynolds Metal Company, completed in 1963, is located across from the present Podvin Park, which was, by the way, dedicated the year of this photograph. So that's when it officially opened. And by 1974, Podvin Park had been built out. And notice that the block between 5th and 6th Streets in Dillon and Kretsch still hasn't been developed. So everything's developing around it. Don't really have the answer here. Probably the person who owned it continued to want it to do farm, whatever they wanted, or they wanted the space, but it had not been built out, and it's already 1974. The red dotted line, that is 9th Street. You can see no development happening. So it's 1974, and I think in a lot of people's minds, if you weren't here or paying attention, which I didn't very rarely, you can see that there's no residential growth in 1974, and that all changes in 2022. So now we jump to present day aerial map, and you can see how many homes. So we think we had a lot of homes built in the Sisters and the Interlake subdivision. That is equal. It's 1/3 of the area that we're looking in this kind of pie-shaped map. It's huge. And you can see our little questionable spot to the southeast of Podvin Park has now been finally developed somewhere between 1974 and 2022. And if you check out the upper right-hand corner, you can see that things have begun at the new high school in 2021. So that ends our maps, and we're going to get back to Podvin Park and start with Podvin Park as our main locator. Located at the intersection of 9th and Deborah Streets, basically, not quite, but basically, Podvin is one of the largest parks in the city and is a well-known landmark area. Took a few years for the 10-acre park to take shape, but by 1966, some park amenities such as baseball fields, playground equipment were added. It would take a few more years to install additional fields and basketball courts. Today, adding to the mix is a skateboard ramp, youth football, soccer fields, hockey and skating rinks, an indoor and outdoor pavilion that can be rented, and ample parking to hold great events like White Bear's Touch a Truck every year. FYI, I got to pause on this one. This is me. If you haven't been to Touch a Truck, I don't care who you are or what age you are, this is one of the coolest events involving multiple municipalities, private businesses, emergency services, farm machinery. For those of you that remember going to State Fair, I know Machinery Hill is still there, which was one of my favorites as a kid, that this is this times 100. It is so cool. And to watch the kids, and you can see in the upper left corner, the helicopter comes in and lands in the field. It is a fabulous free event put on the springtime every year. Now, who's Podvin? Podvin Park is named after Al Podvin. And it's well-deserved that Al got the name of this regional park for our city. He served on the White Bear Lake City Council from 1927 to 1962. He was a White Bear Lake firefighter from 1935 to 1956. He served as fire chief from 1939 to 1946. He was president of the Chamber of Commerce in 1937 and was one of the founding members of the White Bear Lake Lions Club in 1945. Can you imagine the changes and decisions he faced over 3 decades? Think about it. From the Roaring 20s, Prohibition, the Great Depression, World War II, and the housing boom and the growth. The boom, bust boom, and development and growth that he helped guide as an elected official, a business leader, and a community volunteer is really unparalleled. I mean, there'd obviously been growth, but with the times that have changed, White Bear area at that time, he was guiding that. Mr. Podvin was also a business owner. He was the owner of White Bear Motor Sales, a Ford dealership from 1925 to 1955. The business was originally located at the corner of 4th and Clark, directly across from the Armory from 1925 to 1945. Today, the site is Revive Salon right next door to Abbott Paint and Carpet. In 1945, Podvin moved his business to the 4700 block of Clark, which became part of White Bear's first auto strip. That would later, as we all know, move to Highway 61. This is basically the same area where Fraser's Automotive Services operates today. Here's a great photo of Al delivering the newly designed Ford for 1949 to Mrs. Clarence Furnell, right off the showroom floor. And really, honestly, folks, look to the left. You don't see flowers like that at car dealers ever. I was going to say anymore, but really ever. I'm sure that's an arrangement that even Scott Mueller can appreciate. In 1955, Al sold his Ford dealership to Herb Towsley, who operated on Clark Avenue for a few years, but moved the business because of a fire to County Road E and Highway 61. Probably also wanted a little bit more space at that time. And if you lived in Minnesota, especially the Twin Cities area in the 1980s and 90s, can you ever forget this guy? Really? It was funny because a lot of people thought this was Herb Towsley, but he was just another hired TV pitchman. Al Podvin died in 1981 and is buried at St. Mary of the Lake Cemetery. And a very, very odd coincidence. I went to research this, see Al's grave, take a picture of it. And I look to the left, and what do you know? He's buried right next to Jack Yost, another city leader whom a park was named after. Yost Park was named after Jack Yost, who's known as the father of the White Bear Rescue Squad. And literally today, folks, still is nationally recognized as an early pioneer establishing ambulance and EMT services. Just thought that was a really weird coincidence. Got nothing to do with this neighborhood, but sometimes I go down rabbit holes. All right, slide 41. We move on to the Pineview Apartments, which is directly west on 9th Street of this pod. The Pineview Apartments were built in 1971 and 72 and were part of the Auditors Subdivision number 3. That's a really exciting name there. This aerial photo is looking south towards the Girls Street, so the left-right street is going to be 7th there. All right, heading northeast of Podvin Park, if you turn north from 9th Street onto Deborah Street, You'll come to Thury Court, a small cul-de-sac with just 4 homes that were built from 1990 to 1995. Have not been able to track down who or what Thury is. So folks, this is where we kind of do this program. We're looking out for help. If you have any information that there are places where we just don't have information, we can't dig anything up or find a lead as to who Thury or what Thury is. I'm assuming it's some person's name, but please give the Historical Society a call. So being going north on Deborah, you go past Thury and you arrive at the Babe Ruth baseball fields. The fields were once part of the industrial park, with the first 2 fields being built around 1966. The land for the third field was later donated from Weyerhaeuser, the paper business, to the west in the 1980s. All right, so that leads us to the 9th Street Industrial Park. So the area east of Otter Lake Road, south of the railroad tracks, north of 9th, and obviously west of Deborah, it was officially set aside as an industrial park. Conversations began happening in the mid-50s, probably a little bit sooner before they officially took place, about creating an industrial park, but they did have some practical difficulty. The property was located in township, but adjacent to the city. The difficulty was that any large business or manufacturer would need power, sewer, and water, which the township did not have. So fast forward to 1962, and conversations were getting serious with Reynolds Metals Company. The township and city did work together for the betterment of the community and did reach an agreement. They did agree that getting industry into the White Bear area as a whole meant jobs and meant growth for everyone. So it was with great fanfare, it was announced that the Reynolds Metals Company was coming to town. I always knew it as, by the way, Reynolds Aluminum. That's all I ever called it. Reported that the firm indicated it will employ up to 75 persons and engage principally in the production of cans for the Hams Brewing Company of St. Paul. Way to keep it local. Reynolds Metal Company was founded in 1919. At the time, Reynolds was the second largest aluminum manufacturer in the world. So this was a big deal, folks, to get this company into White Bear Lake. So big that in 1957, they launched an iconic product that every kitchen and outdoor grill person knows: aluminum foil, forever known as Reynolds Wrap. Not a lot of products take over a name, such as Kleenex, things like that, but Reynolds Wrap was one of them. The Reynolds plant lasted until the mid-1970s, when it was shut down, and it was vacant for a few years before being purchased by Weyerhaeuser, one of the world's largest forest product companies, in 1979. Weyerhaeuser would manufacture container board packaging and recycling business at this plant. 30 years later, in 2008, Weyerhaeuser then sold the location to International Paper Company, a global manufacturer of paper packaging products. Seemed to be a theme here. After 60 years, not much has changed, but there is one interesting footnote to the 9th Street Industrial Park area. In the late summer of 1939, there was an organized effort to build an airport using the 9th Street Industrial Park land. The airport would stretch all the way to County Road G, otherwise known as Highway 96. On August 25th, 1939, the White Bear Press reported a Mr. Foster Hannaford addressing the White Bear Association, and quote, "A field and shop would soon require 60 to 80 employees, besides making White Bear a prominent mid-U.S. aviation center." So just like the recruitment of Reynolds Metals companies, the airport was about jobs and local importance. Ironically, just 1 week later, during which the White Bear Association formed an airport committee, they met and then reported adverse findings. The conversation continued into early 1940 with an editorial published in the White Bear Press, but soon died out. Just think about that. We could have been the home to Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. Think about that, between Birch Lake and downtown. So here's the industrial park today. You can see the businesses pretty much have continued west towards Otter Lake, but that brings us back into our neighborhoods. So again, kicking off the streets, going back, is Quast Court. The cul-de-sac is named after the developer Sean Quast, and the 7 homes were built over 10 years beginning in 2003. So luckily, not a lot of research was required, because the developer Sean Quast named the street after himself, or maybe his family. One of my favorites, literally in the entire area, located in the western part of the area. The street's known as the Girls or the Sisters, but I hear the Girls more often than not. From west to east is Sandra Lane, Carolyn Lane, Sharon Lane, Peggy Lane, Karen Place, and Deborah Street. They were the second large area in White Bear that was part of the 1950s suburban growth. Carolyn, Sharon, and Peggy were first in 1955, 56, and 57, followed by Sandra, Karen, and Deborah a few years later. The developers were Kenneth Peterson, a local contractor who had two daughters, Sandra and Sharon. His partner was F.W. Jansen, known as Bill, who also had two daughters, Carolyn and Karen. We were unable to identify who exactly Deborah and Peggy were. Again, if anybody out there knows the story, I'd love to hear it. But we do know that Bill Jansen was quite the mover and shaker. And I'm going to go down a rabbit hole a little bit and step out of the neighborhood for a second. But beginning in the 1930s, Jansen owned multiple businesses around town, beginning at the north end of the town with Jansen's Motel, which is now the Best Western Plus White Bear Country Inn and Rudy's Red Eye Grill, a favorite spot for a lot of people. In the 1940s, he also owned the malt shop on Washington Square. Today, that exact same location is the Cobblestone Cafe. Bill also co-owned the malt shop with his sister, who we believe to be the manager. Here's a look inside the diner with Ruth and a somewhat happy co-worker. I don't know. She doesn't look like she's, I'll just stop and refrain right there. But what's cool is that you can see fresh pie on that counter. And Bill is doing some cross merchandising. Again, he was a shaker and baker, and he's trying to advertise over there on the wall. Hey, stay at Jansen's, just 4 blocks north on Highway 61. Bill not only had the north side covered, but he had the south side covered. So coming and going into White Bear and out of White Bear on Highway 61, he had a place for folks on a budget. They could stay at Cabin Camp, located on Highway 61 on Goose Lake. You could stop by and rent a cabin, get an ice cream, have a burger, all at Cabin Camp. In 1941, Cabin Camp took a huge hit with the tornado that came through White Bear Lake. Those cabins obviously were tossed around like dice on our board. This aerial photo was taken right after the tornado, looking southeast at Goose Lake, and you can see Goose Lake Island. Yes, Goose Lake did in fact have an island. The island became part of the new Highway 61 land bridge, or isthmus, that divided the lake in two. The same thing happened to Birch Lake with Highway 96, or County Road G if you've been paying attention. The lake looks more like a river with the flooding and the water current from the tornado. In 1941, Goose Lake was almost all marsh and cattails from the drought of the 1930s. And this is not the first time lake levels has gone up and down in our area, as we are all aware. The location and building are still being used today as Cabin 61 after a few additions, a lot of rehab. And it was forever the little bar for many, many, many decades. And some of those cabins that were tossed around, they are still being rented today. I think Bill would be proud of that. So moving back to our neighborhood, we're going to go to Brook Court. And I said I was going to go west to east, and I didn't forget about Brook Court. Just wanted to talk about the girl streets first because Brook didn't come along until 1996. So the court is pretty much a cousin, a stepsister of the sisters. I don't know. The developers of the Timberwood Plat were Richard Shear, and a Maplewood developer, and Eugene Arndt of Arndt Construction in Hugo, who's still in business today. I actually called and asked the owner who Brook was, and he said he didn't remember and he would call back. Well, I never got that call, but I think he thought I was asking for a donation for the Historical Society, and on second thought, I should have. But moving on, we get on to Dillon. Dillon Street is a short street that oddly ends at 7th and then turns into Woodcrest going north. South of 5th Street, Dillon turns into a drainage pipe known as Dillon Ditch to a lot of folks around town, because at one time it was an open ditch that drains over 800 acres of stormwater all the way down into the forebay that's next to Columbia Park, which then leads back to the Dillon name. The Dillon name, this is partially in township, partially in the city today. Dillon Street and Ditch are named after Michael Dillon, who owned an 80-acre farm south of Highway 96 between Columbia Park and Birch Lake. Margaret Street is named after Dillon's wife. Grace Avenue has a few options. This is one of the things that happens in research. One, it could be Michael's wife, Margaret's middle name. Margaret's middle name was Grace. Or two, it could be their youngest daughter, born in 1903. Her name was also Margaret Grace. And number three option, Michael's son, meaning Michael and Margaret's son, Bill Dillon, has stated that his father named the street after his sister, Bill's aunt, Grace. Again, things get cloudy over time. All three are possible. It's one of the fun things and frustrating things about researching history. So the Dillon family was born in Canada, and in 1853, they first appeared on the 1885 Minnesota Census and had one daughter. And then in 1900 US Census, Michael and Margaret now have 8 children. Their ninth, Margaret Grace, who we just talked about, hadn't arrived yet. Michael Dillon died on July 4th, 1917, and is buried at St. Mary of the Lake, and his obituary appeared in the White Bear Press, where he is mentioned as one of the early pioneers of this vicinity, and that is no doubt true. Margaret and Michael's second son, Walter, went on to farm land east of Centerville Road, a very large tract of land, and Centerville Road and County Road H2 area. Walter's farm has been very well documented with photographs, especially in the 1920s, and it captures, a lot of those photos capture a time that obviously was changing, but yet reached back 50 years and was about to come to an end. So moving there to Kretsch. I'm just going to say it, no offense to anybody that lives on it, but it's just not, Kretsch just doesn't really roll off your tongue. But we have not found any information on who Kretsch is, but the land was platted in 1914 as W.F. Kretsch's Addition. And the homes in the area were built beginning in the 1920s along First Street, and they kept continuing on there all the way up to the 1950s. So again, anybody, if you've got information on Kretsch, love to know. Moving on, we get to Wood Avenue. And again, Wood Avenue is a non-contiguous street that is north and south of 9th Avenue. I know I said we wouldn't talk about generic names, but there could be something more to this avenue's name. So during research, looking at the 1916 plat map just north of what would be Podvin Park, we noticed something, a property owned by Molly Wood. Now, this could be a coincidence. And there was a Molly, correct spelling, by the way, was Mollie, who married a farmer, Charles Wood, and her maiden name was Hammond. And what's interesting about that, Hammond, Hammon, as in Hammond Road with a D at the end. Hammond is incorrectly spelled, but still being used today. And by the way, that's not the first typos that happen in street names around White Bear. But what makes us think that this is not a coincidence is the proximity of Hammond Road to the Molly Wood property. It's the first street north of her property, and it's obviously bisected by the railroad tracks. Worth noting is that Hammond Road has also been called Town Road and also was designated as County Road H, not H2, but H, which makes sense because it is exactly 1 mile north of County Road G or Highway 96, as all Ramsey County roads are spaced 1 mile apart. So we got one mystery solved. Maybe it leads to the next one, which is Lombardy Lane. Lombardy Lane could almost be considered a continuation of 8th Street and is part of the Lily's Westlake Plat Number 1. It took almost 30 years to build the 8 homes that surround Lombardy Lane. The first was built in 1947, and the last completed 30 years later in 1976. With that, again, no information, zero on who Lombardy is, and I don't want to hear it from any Green Bay Packer fans. What is interesting is comparing the 1947 and 1922 aerial photos, 1947 on your left, 2022 on your right. You can still see that the original turnaround cul-de-sac that was there in 47 has been maintained and is still there in 2022. As a matter of fact, I know the snowplowers, it's a pretty tight turn for them to get in and around there. Moving on to Campanaro Lane, heading north of where we were, it was Campanaro Gardens, first and second edition, which was platted in 1978 and 1979. The 25-acre site was owned by Joseph Campanaro, who was a vegetable grower or truck farmer for 40 years before retiring in 1978. The Campanaros sold their crops to local grocers and farmer markets in the area. Georgia Lane is named for Georgia Campanaro, Joseph's wife, who passed away in 1993, followed by Joseph in 1998. Both passed away in Florida after they retired to the state, and they are now buried at Fort Snelling, as Joseph was a private serving during World War II. Then we come on to Lemire Lane and Lemire Circle. They are essentially named after the entire Lemire family, whose roots go back to the date back in the White Bear area to the 1850s. The Lemires themselves, who have at least 4 generations as carpenters and local home builders. In 1983, Lemire Builders, Inc., owned by Alvin and Bob Lemire, developed the area roughly the same time as Campanaro Gardens. There are other smaller Lemire family plats that dotted this area, the entire area going down to 4th Street over the years, that were developed, some as 1 or 2 homes, some as 3 or 4. Many of these homes were built in the 1930s and 1940s, were really precursors of the modern ramblers of the 1950s. Moving on from Lemire, we get to our first school name. Lincoln Elementary was one of 2 of the first modern elementary schools built by the White Bear Lake School District in 1952. The other new school was Webster, which was the second school to bear the Webster name. That story's for another What's in a Name program. Both schools were built to accommodate the existing and future growth that was coming. It's funny that they kept the same lettering on the school, Lincoln School. Northeast of Lincoln Elementary is Campbell Avenue, another non-contiguous street that runs north of 9th and south of 7th Avenues. We could not exactly identify who Campbell Avenue was named after, but most likely it was after Fred G. Campbell and or the entire Campbell family. Fred G. Campbell was a substantial landowner in the village of White Bear in 1907. The family owned over 80 acres between 5th Street and Weber Street and Bald Eagle and Wood Avenue, including the eventual site of St. Mary of the Lake Church. But the avenue could have easily been named after Fred C. Campbell, Fred G. Campbell's son. Fred G. Campbell was the superintendent of the White Bear Post Office from 1918 to 1949, and a member of the White Bear Fire Department from 1909 to 1951. Serving until the year that he passed away. Fred C. Campbell is a very interesting character, so you got to bear with me on this one. I'm going to go down another rabbit hole a little bit. Campbell was instrumental in getting the White Bear area a permanent official government post office. He worked tirelessly in the late 30s to get the U.S. Postmaster to spend funds, precious funds, during the Great Depression for a new post office. For 40 years, the post office had been located in the Getty building right across the street on 3rd Street from the future post office, which was completed in 1940. The Getty building, built in 89, is still being used today and has almost been entirely remodeled and refurbished, and it's a gem for downtown. Today, the new old post office, I need a whiteboard to keep track of what's new and what's new. The new post office, or the old new post office, is Premier Bank. Plenty of changes, but it is still the same building sitting in the exact same place. I think anyone that was around from 1978 to 1989 still longs for the days of Bobby's in the Park and the music of Dan Perry and John Evans, and their popovers were amazing. Bobby's popovers, not Dan and Perry's. I don't know how good of cooks they were, but back to Fred. Fred was also the fire chief when the department took possession of White Bear's first modern fire engine, the 1930 LaFrance, at a cost of $23,000. That's almost $500,000 in today's money, folks. A very large expenditure for a population of about 2,500 people. That's a huge, huge expenditure. But they had to do it. They had to modernize. That same fire truck is still part of the White Bear Lake Fire Department's fleet and used for special events today. Fred also served with the Company K of the Home Guard during World War I, pictured here in 1917. Campbell is listed as 3rd row from the left front. In 1920, he sold his home to St. Mary of the Lake Church that would become the second parish house for $10,000. Again, St. Mary of the Lake Church, Campbell property were one and the same, being sold off over that time period. The home was moved to the corner of 4th and Bald Eagle, adjacent to the church. It's worth noting about Fred, and this is why I'm going down the rabbit hole, that Fred was obviously quite the personality and also an amateur photographer, by the way. He obviously loved cars. There are numerous pictures of Fred behind the wheel of multiple cars. It was obvious that Fred also enjoyed life and being outdoors. Here he is on White Bear on an ice boat in 1910. He's sailing on a gaff-rigged scow, again, 1910. Fred is on the far right. Here he is shooting stuff at the White Bear Gun Club with his friends in 1907. Fred is buried in St. John in the Wilderness Cemetery, and we sincerely owe our thanks for his photography and his service. He's credited for taking many, many pictures, and Fred is possibly one of the most photographed people in the White Bear area at that time. But one of his longest lasting contributions that Fred provided was aerial photos of the east side of the White Bear area taken in 1932. There were some great shots and nothing had been done. I mean, planes hadn't been around that long, let alone to be able to get up and take a camera with them, but leave it to Fred to do that, to get up in plane and go take pictures. Thank you, Fred. All right, enough about my crush on Mr. Campbell. Before White Bear High School was built in 1918, part of this site was the home of the Ramsey County Fairgrounds from 1913 to 1954, with the exception of 1946 when the fair was canceled due to a polio outbreak. As with all county fairs, they serve to help farmers network and learn about the latest agricultural techniques. All activities were held in tents until 1924, and then the first livestock buildings were built. The exhibit hall, seen here in the foreground with the arrow pointing north, was added in 1924, and a racetrack opened in 1937 and hosted horse and bicycle racing, amongst others. Activities included horse shows, horse pulling contests, airplane rides, Native American dancers, plenty of amusement rides. And in the very early years of the fair, a drum corps composed of Civil War veterans went on parade at the fair. Impressive. The exhibit hall that was built for the fair in 1924 went on to become the Hippodrome Ice Arena. This image, circa 1930, shows two time periods colliding with a horse-drawn carriage and a Ford Model A sedan next to the Hippodrome. It didn't take long for the community to figure out that the building, hey, could also double as an indoor skating rink in the winter. I don't know. Somebody thinks we like hockey in this community. I don't know. Moving on, the Hippodrome, the Hip gained minor notoriety in 1978 when a scene from the film Ice Castles was shot there. The rumor mill was that the producers were looking for a rundown, quote, rundown ice arena. I think today that term would be retro or vintage. So almost 40 years before the school district purchased the property adjacent and south of the fairgrounds, this would pave the way for White Bear's first true high school secondary building. That original building now houses the school district's administration offices. Construction started in 1918, and the class of 1919 was the first to graduate with 10 folks in the class. What you're seeing here is the original building, but that building did not last long. The class of 1920 doubled and was over 20 students, and by 1924, it was obvious that expansion was needed. This seems to be a pattern, by the way, for the next 100 years, just saying. In 1927, north and south wings had been completed. This is one of the aerial photos taken by Fred Campbell in 1932. You knew I couldn't just leave Fred Campbell out of it again. The Ramsey County Fair would continue to be located here for another 18 years, and again, referring to the 1932 timeframe. White Bear continued to grow, and another expansion was needed. In 1936, an extension to the south wing with 2 stories of classrooms and the addition of a 1,200-seat auditorium that also doubled as a gym. You can imagine how big of a deal this was for the community, folks. A 1,200-seat auditorium where people could gather, they could have shows. It was a big deal. There was a White Bear auditorium that actually burned down, got rebuilt, became the YMCA. Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong because I'm going off script, but that eventually became Kellerman's Event Center. All right, so fast forward 20 years to 1953, and we see another aerial photo, not by Fred, but what became White Bear's new junior-senior high school building. The addition more than doubled the size of the school, but keep in mind that the school would now house 6 grades, not just 4. And of course, the upper classes took over the new building, leaving the junior hires to the older southern half. Only 5 years later, after the 1953 expansion, it became apparent that a new high school would be needed. 5 years after that huge expansion. And the area that we know, that we now have known since the fall of 1983, 39 years, folks, became known as North Campus. So in 1963, construction began for the new and modern Round High School. White Bear was hailed for the cutting edge design, but many a student would curse that committee who selected the winning design as they walked around and around and around. There were a few additions over the years. An ironic rectangular wing was added to the northeast, and the Division Street side became formalized with a main entrance and a cafeteria expansion. And that brings us to 2022, when if you haven't driven by the new high school area, you need to. After almost 40 years, it was time to consolidate the two campus high school. In 2021, construction began on the newest White Bear Lake Area High School that will house grades 9 through 12. This aerial view is looking south with White Bear Lake, the lake of White Bear Lake, in the background. The additions will be larger than the original round school and is a complete campus-wide renovation. Parking was not forgotten for those of you who live in the neighborhood. The new high school will have more parking than South Campus has today. This photo is looking west towards Bald Eagle Avenue. Looking north with Bald Eagle Lake in the upper left, the new high school will have an indoor court field house, stadium, track, and multiple turf practice fields, both on the north and south side of the building. And then we go back to the original White Bear High School building that has now become Central Middle School and has been for a while. Central Middle School is technically the youngest of White Bear's middle schools. Sunrise Park opened in 1959, and Central didn't receive its name until 1964, when the new Round High School opened. We have found records of when Central was named, but not why. Most likely, and without a lot of creativity, it was named after Central Avenue, which honestly, for creativity's sake, Central Avenue doesn't exactly stir the pot. No information is available as to why the city and or village came to the conclusion that Central, but this is conjecture on our staff's part that it's a street that is exactly halfway between Division and Baldique, making it Central. Just a guess, folks. We do not know. Any information, greatly appreciated. Moving directly south, we come to Washington Square Apartments that opened in 1979. A developer purchased the old Washington School and raised the building in 1978. Washington School was the second modern school built in 1895 to serve the students on the west side of the railroad tracks, replacing West Side School. The following year, Washington School opened and the class of 1896 graduated from here. That was a class of one. Miss Frances Whitaker holds the honor of being the first graduate of White Bear High School from any building. The school received multiple additions by 1910. A side note is that from 1969 to 1967 to 1969, Washington School became the first home for Lakewood State Junior College. One of the homes, the Armory, was used for classes also, with 500 students later moving to South White Bear Lake, becoming what we all know is now Century College. Beautiful building, though. This is a photo. We found it because of the school in the background, but you can see how the school did dominate the area as far as the height. But this is a photo of the Peltier House on Bald Eagle Avenue. Very typical of the homes built in this time period. The Washington School Bell, by the way, was saved and it was rededicated by the White Bear Lake Area Alumni Association in cooperation with the school district in 2019. The bell was incorporated into the White Bear District Center sign that now sits in front of the original 1918 building. Our last stop on our tour here is the West Side Ball Field. White Bear had its own baseball field that was basically on the northwest corner of 4th and Bald Eagle. Baseball had been played since the Civil War and was well on its way to becoming America's pastime at that time by the turn of the 20th century, when White Bear formed its own town ball team. Baseball also served as an economic development tool. White Bear was still a resort town at the time and hosted many exhibition games. Teams from other communities would arrive by train at the depot and walk the 4 blocks down to the field. You got one guess who these photos are attributed to. Yep, Fred Campbell. He was a player on the team. This is circa 1908, but he played for many years on that. That is going to conclude our presentation of Podvin Park and the White Bear Lake School neighborhoods. They're unique areas that have seen immense change, growth, development over the past 170 years. From open fields, marsh, farms, schools, light industry, and most importantly, homes have become the core of these neighborhoods. I hope you've enjoyed the program, and please remember that history is so much more than just dates, dusty books, and forgotten records. The What's in a Name program help us reflect on the places, the people, and the stories, all which connect us to our past. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll turn it back over to Sarah for questions. Sarah.
All right, so we have, we actually don't have any questions submitted yet. So if anybody has questions they want to throw out there, please feel free. But I have a couple of comments or questions, which you knew I would. Out of curiosity, that when you first started talking about the maps and the roads coming into town, you mentioned the Rice Lake Road. Is that Rice Street now?
It was not right. No, it was not. It was the road is it's confusing because it is not Rice Street that's coming up out of there. It's technically it's Little Canada Road, and it is labeled, but then it branches off and there's no name for about 2 miles. And then all of a sudden what I believe would be White Bear Avenue merges. They merge together and then they split apart again at Lambert Lake area.
Okay. Just curious. It's just one of those, I always assumed it was named for Rice, not the lake, but the
right.
So.
Well, and there is a Rice Lake in township there. So
right. So who knows? And then just another comment on the auditorium piece. You were spot on. The Kellerman's, what is today Kellerman's Event Center, was actually built in 1907 as the YMCA and then became the auditorium. So you flip those around, but you had all the right elements. And then, as you said, that burned not long before the community built the one at the school. So, well,
sidebar on that, what I did find, again, Fred Campbell and doing the research, I just became a big fan, obviously. But it's, Al Podvin too, these folks that contributed to our community, along with talk about the Molly Woods, the Hammonds, all those folks that really built our community. Mm-hmm. But it was interesting. I found a picture of Fred Campbell appearing in a play at that auditorium. So I did not use it, but because I could not identify him, but he was identified.
I'm beginning to think that we're going to have a Fred Campbell program at some point. So that may be your next assignment.
Yeah, maybe.
All right. We did have one comment, not a question, but a comment from one of our viewers that said, wonderful in-depth on the area. Thank you. So that's always nice to hear. Great job, Dan. Thank you for digging in. I know you've spent weeks doing the research on this. And so it's nice to be able to piece it together. And
it was my pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, folks, for tuning in.
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great rest of the night.